All right. Welcome, everyone. So happy to have you here. Welcome to the Peace Leadership Collaborative Gathering. My name is Lisa, and I'm a founding member of the Peace Leadership Collaborative. I'm really excited to have you all here. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Peace Leadership Collaborative, it's a global hub for peace leadership scholars and practitioners to advance and promote peace leadership practice and scholarship through resources, research, education, and connecting peace leaders worldwide, which is what we're doing today. So we have these interactive gatherings every quarter, in addition to having other events. So these are really spaces designed to bring people together who are engaged in or interested in peace leadership, people coming from all different sectors, all different parts of the globe. It's opportunity to learn from one another, to talk about current challenges or opportunities that we're seeing, and to identify ways that we can, individually and collectively promote positive peace and challenge violence and aggression that's happening around the world. So thanks for being with us today. For those of you who just joined, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat, please do. And I think we're ready to get started with today's session. So the topic for today, which our PLC member, when I say PLC, it's Peace Leadership Collaborative, which is, can be quite a mouthful. So you'll hear me say PLC a few times today. So our member, Aline Baird, is going to lead today's session. But before I turn it over to her, just to say a couple things about today. So we're going to kind of take a step back in today's session. So there's, as we all know and are thinking about constantly, so many crises and things happening around the world. And we're going to take a step back from, debating and talking about specific conflicts, to talk about and explore kind of a deeper question around how the language we use to describe war shapes public consent, political decision making, and the space that's available for us as peace leaders and for peace leadership to happen. So really excited to have Aline lead this session, and to have designed and brought this topic to us, and created this space. So Aline, I'm going to turn it over to you. And please introduce yourself before you get started. And then we'll have, just so everyone knows, we'll have some presentation, just a little bit, but then there'll be lots of time for discussion throughout today's session. Over
Well,
to you,
thanks,
Elaine.
Lisa. Let's make sure I'm off mute. Okay. Even 4 years later, there's still that. You're on mute. You're on mute. So I'm Aline Bayard. I've been participating in the Peace Leadership Collaborative for a couple of years now, and I'm really grateful for the leadership that both Lisa and Whitney have provided to gather us globally on such an important, maybe the most important topic in my lifetime. My background is that I've been actually in January I finished my term as the chair of the Leadership for Peace community of the International Leadership Association, and I did my doctoral research and have continued to do research in the area of peace building. I want to just do one quick shout out because I did put something on LinkedIn, and one of my dearest friends, Mary Lee, is joined us, and
Ah,
I'm just so thrilled to see you, ML. And it just shows the power of folks that we have, people we think are part of the peace building kind of community, and then other people join. So now I'm really nervous about doing even a better job because my friend is on. So thanks for joining, Mary Lee. And Jill, it's so good to see you as well. Okay, so let me just share my slide. We do have a few. This is mostly a very interactive conversation, but I did want to set the table. So let me share my slide. Always the most difficult part for me in any of these things is getting my technology to participate. All right, so kind of what got me thinking. I was, as I do every morning several weeks ago, opening up the newspaper, reading the newspaper. I read several papers a day, and I saw an editorial by someone in the New York Times talking about the terms war of choice and war of necessity, and debating about whether or not, I don't remember if it was Venezuela or Iran or whatever war that the United States was currently involved in and initiated, being a war of choice and a war of necessity. And I thought to myself, well, wow, I've never heard those terms before. And they really got me thinking. And they got me thinking, and I've kind of tried to concretize the kind of the punchline for what we're about to explore together. They're not just analytical terms. They're those terms, and using those terms in our common vocabulary, there's moral, there's political, there's psychological frames that really shape what we believe is inevitable versus what remains within our agency. And if we say that there is a war of necessity, what are the implications for us in the world, both as people in the peace building field, whether we're doing research as academics, whether we are working at the United Nations, whether we are on the ground, as many people that participate in this group and other similar groups around globally are doing the work on the ground. Are the implications? So I'm going to read a couple of things I put together and then have a few more slides. So the distinction between a war of necessity and a war of choice entered contemporary policy discourse most prominently through the work of Richard Haass, who used the terms to differentiate between conflicts undertaken in response to imminent threats and those pursued despite the availability of alternatives. In his analysis of U.S. foreign policy, Haass characterized the 1991 Gulf War as a war of necessity and the 2003 Iraq War as a war of choice, offering a framework that has been widely adopted in political, academic, and media narratives. And I want to underscore the word narrative. While the distinction appears straightforward, it carries significant normative weight. It does not merely describe wars, but implicitly evaluates them, shaping perceptions of legitimacy, prudence, and moral justification. For those involved in peace leadership, this raises a critical question. When we label a war as necessary, what assumptions are embedded in that designation? And what alternatives may already be set aside? This distinction between necessity and choice can subtly shift a conflict from the realm of human decision-making into that of inevitability. As such, examining the language of war is not an abstract exercise. It is a way of reclaiming awareness of agency, responsibility, and the possibilities that language can either illuminate or obscure. So that's the conversation we're going to embark in together. Got about 10 minutes here of setup, and then we'll, including a couple of early breakout sessions, and then about a good 1/3 of our time together will be having an opportunity for us to talk in small groups. Let's get my advanced to work here. So some protocols I'd recommend for us. We want to bring our thinking to the emerging language of war. We're not here to debate, as Lisa mentioned, particular wars. This is more a meta conversation. We want to examine if war is normalized, what are the implications both for us and future generations? I will give you a brief history of these key terms. I've already started to elaborate them just a little bit. We want to respect diverse perspectives, and again, perspectives around the conversation of vocabulary narratives. This is not about, well, this war was necessary and this war wasn't necessary. That's not the rabbit hole we want to go down into. So we really want to stay at the meta level. So I've already mentioned that the origin of the term really came from Richard Haass. Here's a picture of Richard Haass. He said that the war of necessity is undertaken when our vital interests are at stake with no viable alternatives. That's how that particular term was defined. And a war of choice is one undertaken when alternatives to force are available. So those are the kind of the grounding definitions we're going to be using together. He used the two Iraq wars to illustrate that the Gulf War was framed as a war of necessity, and the Iraq War was framed as a choice. And this particular framing of the Iraq War became quite controversial. And again, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole, but if you're interested in that scholarship, it's really fascinating how that term applied to the Iraq War created a whole lot of discussion and really important dialogue around how we're even talking about war. So here are some of the three ways we think about war of necessity. And these are the way we think, these are the things of the way we think about war of choice. And I think it's important to understand that these are judged often negatively in hindsight. So at the front end, when we're talking about, for example, what's happening in the Middle East right now, whether one side says, well, it's a war of necessity, and one other perspective is a war of choice, it's after it already happens. And I found that really important as we're thinking about this with our brains. It's not like at the front end, it's used to justify the action afterwards. So that's something we should be considering as thoughtful leaders.
Lincoln?
International, please. Does someone have a question? Okay, I heard some noise. So I also wanted to say that international law, so Haas provided these terms, but international law in the courts and like in the Court of Hague, these are also terms that are being used now when we're looking at, war criminals and those kinds of things. So I want to first point out to us that our words create our reality. So when these conflicts are occurring and we're discussing them, that becomes the history, right? That becomes the way that we tell the story about those wars. This was necessary and this was a choice. So I want to take a moment. Lisa, how many people are currently in the conversation?
We've got about 25.
Okay. I do think this is really an important we'll do a quick breakout here. If we consider our words create our reality, I want to give us a moment to do maybe just a 5-7 minute breakout. And we'll probably put us in groups of 5 or 6, depending on where the math goes. And I want you to, and just do a round robin. Think about some of the language you use that either evokes a sense of conflict or a sense of peace. So, for example, when someone says, God, you're really killing it, meaning you're doing a good job. And I often have clients in their conversations go, oh, this team's really killing it. And I'll say, when I'm doing a facilitation, is there a better choice of words we could be using besides using the word, we're really killing it? And sometimes people go, oh, there's just Aline, being a peace builder. And I'll say, no, seriously, is there a better word? Could it be you're really, even if we use the word crushing it, that might not be so visceral. So Lisa, if we can go into breakout rooms and just again, do a round robin, just someone go first and say, think about the words that you're using in everyday vocabulary. This is not to be judgmental, but as we want to start understanding how much this narrative has really infiltrated even people in the peace building pacifist world, how we talk and how that talk is either manifesting conflict and war being normal or other types of realities. Anyone have a question on the instruction? All right, let's just jump in for 5 minutes or so, see what we can come up with, and we'll come back together. Everybody has something they're just, now this is perfect. They're dying to share. I just thought of that, even that if you're dying to share it, but I can't escape it. So let's put ourselves on mute unless we are contributing something, because there's a lot of background noise I'm hearing. I'm going to share one well, actually, Jill, can you share what you talked about in our room?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Jill Tracy. I'm from United Planet and the ILA and the Peace Leadership for Peace group with Aline. I shared that I have my youngest daughter is Gen Alpha. She's 14, and they have a lot of vocabulary that's kind of new and emerging, or at least use of words is, different. Anyway, a common one that they use all the time for this is really great, really wonderful, awesome is from my era. They say slay.
You ever joined the break?
Oh. They say, oh, I got muted too. They say something is slay, which is really amazing, and it's, I think the origins is probably, you're slaying it or whatever, but now it's down to one word because everything is just a one word monosyllabic language in Gen Alpha speak. And so slay is really a popular way to describe something that's wonderful. And slay comes from very gruesome actual meaning. And so it's interesting that that's one of their favorite words to describe wonderful things.
Thank you, Jill. Anybody else have something that was pretty profound that you want to either actually, let's put it in the chat if there were other words or things that was like, oh, I never thought of that, but that term, that word underscores how we've been normalizing killing people. So,
Can I
Mark, I would
come?
encourage you to put yours in yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Munasia joining from Ukraine. Thanks for the Ellen for the conversations. My point is not only the wording, but then the relationship, determine. So we have to look at what is the relational aspect between the parties and where they are heading to. They might use any word or terms if you want to violate or do the violence or they kill the people, to that extreme. So there is more we have to look at on the relational dimension than the word they use it. This could be cultural violence or cultural terminologies they might use regardless of any term. So the reality is determined not only through the wording, but by the relationship between the parties.
Great, thank you for that. I appreciate your very thoughtful contribution. So I'm going to go back and continue the conversation because we'll have plenty of time to chew on this stuff in a few minutes. But I want to put a couple more points on the board here. If I can get my computer to move forward. Okay.
You want to listen to this?
What was that? I'm sorry. Okay, so let's talk about war as a narrative. So war is constructed through both political and media discourse. Think about how we are following current events and how they're framed. So it's constructed through that kind of discourse. It actually shapes the identity of the actors, and I'm going to give you some examples of some language we use that shapes the identity of the people that are involved in the actual conflict. Absolutely influences public perception. The way that wars are covered and described influences how we feel about the wars, how we feel about the people that are either insinuating or instigating, people that are the victims, right? So the language is really critical. And again, as I've been thinking about this particular session and paying more attention to the daily news through these filters, it's really profound in even someone who's fairly well educated in many of the parts of the world through these lenses, how much my perception has been framed and impacted by just what I'm reading every day. And so if you're interested, those of you that are in the scholarship academic world, there's some really interesting very recent scholarship about the language of war. This is just from just 2.5 years ago, looking at what's happened in the Russia-Ukrainian war. And do we even call that a war? People call it a war. I call it an invasion, even something like that. Even if we term something a war, how does that frame what we think? So war is a narrative we can think about as what's called a narrative construction, right? It's not just an event. It's interpreted through language and our framing. And to the gentleman that spoke a few moments ago, also the relationship between the parties involved. The media and the political discourse shape who's the aggressor and who's the victim, whether it's justified and unjustified. I mentioned we are not going to go into discussing whether certain conflicts that are happening around us right now we would deem necessary or a choice. I would invite you to think about some of the conflicts we're seeing right now, particularly in the Middle East, how parties are termed and described and how that frames our feelings about whether it's justified or not. The other point I made a little bit earlier was that the language also influences the memory and how we teach about these conflicts, right? How we teach about World War II, how we teach about Pearl Harbor, right? How we teach about the Holocaust, all these things, how we teach about and how history continues to repeat the way we think about the world, how we justify the behaviors of different nations. It's very powerful to think about just the words that have been used. So I'd like us to consider, and we might add this to the conversation that we're going to have when we go into breakouts towards the end of our conversation here. Who is establishing the vocabulary? I started my career as a journalist, and journalists rely on their sources to tell their stories. And so back when I was a journalist, you had to have at least 3 sources before you publish something. So you could not rely on a single source. You had to triangulate. Now, I was not a war correspondent. I was a business writer, but even that I had to be getting 3 sources. Now we're looking for what's true when we're reading about what's happening in areas of conflict, and it's very hard to understand or trust the language that we're hearing to describe what's happening, because I know I don't trust the fact that how are they getting their information? So who's establishing the vocabulary? So in this idea, in this little image here, does context shape the language, or how much is our language shaping the context, right? So I thought that was an interesting kind of a visual. So here's some examples of how language, the words we use, legitimize or shape how we think about something. Is it defense or is it aggression? Is it security or is it expansion? Liberation or occupation? Defense or retaliation? Insurgent or freedom fighter? Terrorist versus militant? So the language that we're using authorizes the action that actors are taking. So that would be very relevant for people actually in charge of dispensing troops around the world. But for us as people that consume the language, we either support the action or we challenge the action. And what I would have put a little chat thing, I'd like you to put in the chat here maybe some reflections on how you have been moved to action, or even action in the formation of your opinions about certain conflicts, the perspectives and point of views you're taking based on what word here resonates with you. I had a personal situation in one area of the world where I described the actor as a terrorist, and my colleagues said, oh no, they're just freedom fighters. And that's a very big difference in how you look at what's happening on the ground. If you say, well, that's a freedom fighter, that would justify the behavior. And if it's a terrorist, then you would condone the behavior. So there's so many implications to the words that we're consuming as we're looking at what's happening to make sense of the world and the choices we're making in our various contexts in terms of how we're dealing with that. So I would invite you to maybe put some thoughts in the chat, and we'll have a chance to go back and revisit this when we go into small groups. So some of the core tensions, when we're talking about war as a choice or as a necessity when all other alternatives are not available, rhetorically here, if there is an alternative, how would war be necessary in any case? Maybe you don't like the alternative, right? Maybe the one party or one nation state doesn't like the alternative. But if there is an alternative war, why would we accept, or should we accept, the terminology that there are some wars that are necessary? Who gets to define it's necessary? Right? Clearly, we see many instances throughout history where people protest wars, saying we do not buy in to that this is necessary. So there are things that we have done as societies, and think about Arab Spring as one of those examples. And we're challenging, was it necessary? We're challenging who says it's necessary, and what assumptions remain unchallenged. I think this question about what assumptions remain unchallenged is part of the work that we do in the Peace Leadership Collaborative and other organizing, convening groups around the world that are saying, wait a minute, not so fast, right? We are challenging that these things are true in order to justify the conflict. So I showed you a screenshot a few minutes ago about the language of war. We can also look at the language of peace, and not surprisingly, if you Google articles or research on conflict resolution and war, and then you would Google, go into Google Scholar or just any other, even go into ChatGPT and ask for the percentage of the language we're using and the research around language and where it shows up, it's like 25-1 still that we are more interested and focused on, and I use the word digesting because we're internalizing this, war over peace. So what are some implications for peace leaders? And this is really the group that's gathered here. If language shapes the possibilities, and the framing influences action, what is our responsibility to challenge those narratives, right? So we see this kind of train going out of the station. So if we can go back to breakout groups at this point and ask this question, what is our responsibility to challenge these narratives? And if you're interested in also, I'm going to go back a couple of slides when you're in your small group, because we're going to have this one. Who defines necessity? So who defines necessity? And what is our responsibility to challenge narratives? So if we can go back into groups of 5 or 6, whatever you found, and we can mix them up again, Lisa. And I'd like to give us maybe 10 minutes so it doesn't feel rushed. And then we'll come back and report out, and then we'll have a final time together with some additional questions. So if you want to take a picture of the screen, sometimes people take pictures of the screen if you're new to this forum. Anybody has something what I'd like to do is have a broader discussion on those questions or anything else that came out of your conversation that you think would be beneficial for us all to hear. And I'm going to recommend, I think we've got, how many people are 24 people? Probably the best way is just to use the raise hand. And if you don't know how to use the raise hand, just raise your hand. And I'm going to see if I can look at the gallery view. And we'll just call on people to contribute a thought, an insight, a suggestion, an answer. And this is really the beauty of this this group. It's the collaborative that we can share ideas with each other. So if you have something you'd like to contribute, question, either use the raise hand or use your own little hand and raise it up. But we'd have to see you. You'd have to open up your cameras to do that. Anybody have something that came out of that conversation? Anyone want to talk about March Madness, the United States, who's going to win? All right. Looks like I don't see any. Go ahead.
Here we go.
Manjana, thank you.
Okay. Really good conversation in our group. By the way, the first one, also your first question, if I can just go back to it for just a little bit.
Please.
The narrative, right? Because it's also very relevant to this question. So the narrative, who sets the narrative, but also the narrative itself, war of aggression, war of choice, and all of that. But there's also a narrative around it for economic reasons, war for business and money, right? And if we see it from that perspective, the whole efforts around peace building and everything then has to also then be geared towards these people who are making all this money and who are getting benefited from all this money because then it helps them get elected and stuff like that. So that's the other perspective. But in terms of who sets the narrative, really in today's world is the one who has a lot of handle on traditional media and social media. And with social media, more and more, there's no one who can really set the narrative anymore because everybody has access to people. So whoever, is on your algorithm, right? That also contributes. But do we need the responsibility to change as humanitarians? I think we need to also bring in the perspective of humanity and how humanity is suffering and how we bring people together to alleviate that suffering and prevent that suffering as well. And Barbara had a great example from what they were doing. Barbara, did you want to share your experience from Minnesota, I believe, right? I just voluntold Barbara.
Well, I was just saying that the example of the protesters and the supporters of people during the ICE occupation in Minnesota did provide both example and a different kind of narrative, a narrative about neighboring that said, we are acting to protect our neighbors. It's not that we are against holding people accountable if they've committed crimes. That's not what this is about. This is about supporting our neighbors. And so it's a counter narrative in a way. So I was also urging that we draw on the language of nonviolence traditions of, as and Anyana was saying, humanitarian philosophy, to use those sources.
You know, Barbara, I love the reference to neighboring. I think that, I mean, that would be a great dissertation topic. Seriously, like the emergence of neighboring, where did it come from? What does it mean? What motivates somebody, right, to act in that way? Is neighboring different than activism? What kind of activism is neighboring? How much of that's faith? There's so much richness in what's happening, what happened, and even, you know, not everyone that we interact with as people like ourselves would use the word occupation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of us would use the word occupation for ICE coming to Minneapolis. Is ICE going to, and I recognize this is a global audience, so I welcome other contexts and examples around the world. Obviously, if we're in the United States right now, we have a certain context. So ICE is going to the airports now. Well, what is ICE doing at the airports? They don't know how to read the computer to see if I have a gun in my bag. So what is that about, right? So there's so much there, the word occupation. I also want to go back to what is it? Is it Anyana or Anjana? Did I mispronounce your name? I'm sorry.
It's Anjana, but all pronunciations are good for me.
Anjana. Okay, Anjana. Well, people call me Aileen, Eileen, Arlene, so I try and be very, very sensitive to people's pronunciation. So what you said is, I agree with. The narrative is formed by the media, and that narrative justifies war. And when I grew up, that the media had such little impact on it was the politicians, right? The people that were mostly responsible for the acceptance of war was what we heard from political actors. That's shifted now. Political actors may hold the final go, but as a society, we're more influenced in terms of our acceptance, it seems like, of war. I'm saying this is my perspective, not truth, that by what we're seeing in the media. And as you so rightly said, the media is anybody that has a TikTok account, which I do not, by the way. I don't understand TikTok. So I open the floor for other either insights or conversations that came out of your small group. Would love to hear from some additional folks. Munas?
Yeah, thanks. Good to see you, Anjana. I have seen her work in Sri Lanka and around as part of the Red Cross community before I joined you. And back to the topic. Yes, narrative is important to look at, and if you go, we have to deeply reflect on what are the systems and the culture is create these narratives. Who really own these or create these systems? In my small group, in education systems or constitution as a policy or policy. So that is part of systems structure. So there is then this system create a culture that determine whether it should be violent culture or peaceful or cohesive culture. So this is what we have to look into, and then we also want to challenge at that level, which is not visible for us. What is visible is this narrative and the language, and what is not visible is the system and the culture. Let's keep creating. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to read one more. I prepared some notes here, and I was going too much into scholarship and history and having most of our conversation be like this. But what you just said, I think, is really important to follow up with some of the very interesting scholarship around structure. So if I may, just one paragraph. There's a broader body of scholarship suggesting that language used to describe conflict is never neutral. Political scientist Kenneth Waltz emphasized that war is often framed through structural and strategic lenses that can obscure human agency. Now, the culture part isn't in there, but the structural part is. While constructivist scholars like Alexander Wendt have argued that international realities are in part socially constructed through shared ideas and language. That's really what we're talking about today. Similarly, George Lakoff has demonstrated how framing shapes public understanding by activating underlying moral narratives, suggesting that terms like necessity or security do more than inform, they guide interpretation and constrain imagination. And that's the part of this discussion that I find most chilling, is the on the surface, what's benign about language. We're reading things, we're keeping up on things, but there's shaping happening for us as humans and how we are going to think about these matters based on these words. So, and the structures behind them. Oh, Julie, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, just to build off of what you and Manasa are adding here, I kind of frame it as the analysis of the hidden curriculum and thinking about that from like elementary age onwards, and the role that peace education and creating cultures of peace within school or educational settings, of how important that is. And a couple of ideas for that analysis of the hidden curriculum. I focus on this in my book that's for elementary educators for implementing peace education. But asking those kinds of questions, whether it's through professional learning, through the parent organizations, about what hierarchical structures exist, and really exploring the power dynamics that are in place and how those are often socially recreated from culture, from history. I think too, like really the examination of how history is being presented and whose voice is silenced, or whiteness and patriarchal views being centered. How is war framed? Is there a glorification of militarism? Is there a balance of how peace is being presented? And just kind of going from there, are the voices of peacemakers, peace builders, nonviolent strategies, are those being amplified just as much as we're talking about this particular battle? I mean, in the United States, at least, the history textbooks are very, aligned to how wars and battles, and not necessarily centering peace. So just kind of wrapping back to that hidden curriculum, really also in our schools and educational spaces from our elementary on up.
Thank you, Julie. I'll share what's coming in my mind from what you're sharing, which is I had never heard the term Nakba before I engaged in my dissertation research. I don't know how many of you have heard the term Nakba, but it's not taught in the United States. I don't know if it's taught, I don't know where it's taught. But to try and understand the Middle East without understanding the Nakba, it's impossible. So that is like completely missing from many conversations. Yeah, Jill, that was for your daughter. So that, when I learned about the Nakba, and it gave me a completely different view. I mean, I was raised in the United States. I was raised in a Reformed Jewish home. And we never, we read history. We read history, right? We learned about history, but we didn't learn about the Nakba. And how could you learn about the Middle East history without the Nakba? So I think that's a perfect example of the kind of historical slanting, and that might be part of a hidden curriculum, or actually could even be more nefarious than hidden. So that's an example that I bring to the table. Okay, so anything else coming out of that conversation? Then I want to tee up one more opportunity for us to get into small group. We're going to keep you in the same group you were in last time, because presumably you've got some traction going, and we've got a little bit of relationship building. Is there anything else out of this last conversation people would like to contribute to the group potpourri here? All right, I'm going to share one more time. And raise some reflection questions for us. All right, I think I'm sharing. Okay, so And I'll pull this up, and if you could maybe take a picture, and that I'll cut and paste and put it in the chat. So if war is framed as as necessary, what kind of things have already been decided? What's been ruled out? And maybe I forgot who brought this up earlier, but might have been the economic considerations, right? We can't afford not to. That might be an economic thing. What alternatives may have been excluded from consideration? And in this case, it might be fruitful to think about a particular conflict, not to go down the conversation of whether that conflict was justified or not, but more about some of these questions. We've already talked about who has the authority to define necessity, or maybe who's traditionally had the authority and who maybe should have the authority. How does this framing shape our perception and consent? And then this is the question we really wanted us to have an opportunity to spend some time ruminating on. So what are the implications for us, for academics, policymakers, politicians, peace builders, or just members of society? And then where do you see opportunities to shift the language and the outcome? So one of the examples, when Lisa and I were planning this session, I thought about, I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to, is write a letter to the editor of the New York Times on the editorial that basically said, well, these are the two types of war. And say, wait a minute, there's a lot baked into that. So I'm just a member of society, but I can challenge the status quo in terms of how we think about it. So these are the questions that we would put to the group to continue to reflect upon. The one that I would think might have the most juice, that's the least cerebral and the most action oriented, would be, what are the implications? We are all in one or more of these buckets. It even could be parent, as a parent. Jill talked about what she's done. And where can we ourselves shift the language and the outcome? So we're going to go back to small groups for about 17, 20 minutes and give us an opportunity to really leave here with both deeper reflections as well as hopefully some kind of action plan. What can you do in your space, in your part of the world, literally, geographically, but also contextually, to challenge these norms? Because where these norms are heading us is not a place that I think any one of us would choose to go. So these are the questions. If you could take a screenshot. Oops. And leaving with peace research, is it just going to be the study of war? So I'm going to stop sharing and have Lisa do her magic.
All right, welcome back.
What I'd like. Okay, so I know the group I was in had the best conversation, but I'll let other people chime in. If not, I'll take the full 9 minutes. So raise hand or raise the artificial hand. Let's get some outtakes from your conversation. Anything you think would be worth sharing, an insight, a particular finding or action you might be taking. Would love to hear from the group. Anybody want to contribute? You just saw my dog leaving for her daycare. Bye, doggy. Okay, then I'll just go ahead and throw one in for consideration. So Barbara was talking about consequences, and that followed a conversation from Wazi, who talked about war, what's happening in her country in Nigeria, and who's deciding. And so what I started thinking about was, when someone makes a decision to take an action, they've decided it because they think it's worth it, right? They think it's worth it. The people that are engaging, the decision makers in conflict, decide it's worth it, whatever their calculation is, but the consequences of their action is not falling on their shoulders, it's falling on the people who are impacted by the action. So Wazi was sharing that the action that the United States took in Israel to bomb Iran which is closing the Straits of Hormuz, is causing fuel shortages around the world, including food shortages in Nigeria. So I think about in the business context, because I do a lot of consulting work, we do focus groups, we do survey monkeys. Before we make a consequential decision, stakeholders are asked for their opinion about the decision that will be made. Now, they're not always given veto power, but it just occurs to me like no one asks the stakeholders that are going to be impacted by these decisions if they're in agreement with the conflict. I mean, duh, but just the way we talked about it in terms of decisions are made, a calculation must be made on is it worth it, but the people making those decisions are not the people that are paying the price. We're paying the price. So that's an insight I got from Wazi and Barbara. Thank you, friends. And then Barbara said, write the letter to the editor, and I will. All right. Or ChatGPT will, and I will edit it and then send it. Because ChatGPT has been trained by me to have peaceful language. All right, we have just a few minutes left. I would like to hear from some other people. Please share what you were. I'd love to hear from you, Whitney, from your vantage point of being in many of these conversations. Is there anything that you think particularly is a strand that this group would want to follow up on, or anything that contributed to your thinking as our fearless leader?
I don't know about that, but I was going to say, I thought this call was just about calling on Barbara and making Barbara talk about things. I thought I was flying under the radar here, but no, I think it's so important. This conversation, and Aline, the way you framed it, I think is really important for us too. I've been really fortunate, as many of you know, to talk to a lot of peace leaders who are doing this work all over the world and in their communities. And I think one of the things that I hear a lot is about the value of language and how language matters. And I think that you've done such an important job for us in framing what this means and how we talk about things. And I definitely, I stand with Barbara, for sure, write that letter. I think it's so important. And you've got so many folks here to back you up that this is valuable. Folks came in to have these conversations. But I do think that the way that we frame the work that we do matters. And we know that there are a lot of folks doing this work around the world who can't even say the word peace, and that the word peace is a bad thing to say. We have schools here in the United States who talk about character as opposed to peace education, because if they say peace education, people are going to be mad at them. We have colleagues that are doing work in Kashmir who are having the same problems, that peace is seen to be a rhetoric that's actually framed for isolating and separating and dividing people, even though we all know that's not the case. So I think the more we think critically about the language that we use and how we use it, I think it's really important, and I don't know that we do. And I think you've raised this point to us today, that we say things all the time that we don't know is rooted in violence, and that we use those words without really thinking about them. I put in the chat a while ago, I've been trying to come up with something for kill two birds with one stone for years. Julie said feed two birds with one loaf of bread. I've heard feed two families with one loaf of bread. I typically now say do two things at once, but I know it's bad to multitask, so that's not good either. But all these things that are in our language that we just don't really think about, and until we start holding people accountable for the words that they say, so many of our idioms in English, and I'm guessing in other languages around the world too, are rooted in violence. I can think of a handful of examples right now that I've been trying to steer myself away from. And so I really do appreciate the framing of this conversation. And I think we do need to push back. And so I think that letter to the editor is going to be important. I think it's going to be important for all of us to say, we don't have to have wars of necessity. It doesn't exist. It's not a real thing. There are always other choices. We might not like them. But I think it's so important for us to really begin to have those conversations. So thanks for bringing this to us, Eileen, and kind of pushing us and nudging us to be able to begin to do this work from a language perspective. I think it's really important.
Well, oh my God, I love the opportunity to be able to have these conversations, particularly in the state of the world. And I really want to acknowledge Lisa for holding the integrity of the space. It could have been a very dicey conversation, and I do have some strong feelings about what's happening in the Middle East right now. Um, and I would have loved to go there so badly as I have with my friends. Like, what do you mean it's not genocide? Even the Israelis say it's genocide these days. But Lisa's like, we have to be really mindful about where this conversation is going to be navigated. And Lisa, I so appreciate your integrity and making sure that this is a space that's inclusive, that's thoughtful, that people can show up in wherever they are and be able to move the peace conversation forward. And so I hope you feel that you've accomplished that, keeping this wild person in check over here. I also love the fact that people show up from around the world. And we show up from around the world for them. We're so US centric, or I'm so US centric. It's just so, it's very, very empowering to know that there's a global, this collaborative. And I meant this very sincerely, Wazi, is that I apologize on behalf of my country that what we're doing is causing such harm to you and your country people. It makes me really sad. Really sad. Okay, so we have just a couple of minutes. Do you want to set the tone, Lisa, for what's happening the next either conversation or what people can do to continue to contribute?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and a big thank you to Aline for organizing and leading this conversation and creating this space for us today. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks everyone, as Aline said, for being here. We really appreciate it. And for staying for a whole 90 minutes. I really appreciate that. I know it's a big part of your day. I'm going to put in the chat if you're interested in getting involved with the Peace Leadership Collaborative, or if you're interested in learning more, we've got some ways you can do that. If you haven't already joined our mailing list, I strongly suggest that you do. That way you can hear more about future gatherings, future events like this that are happening. We also have a digital magazine called Peace Prospects. So whenever that comes out, it's announced through the mailing list. And we also have other kind of peace leadership resources that we share there. And also just an open invitation to all of you. If you have things you want to share coming out of your work or things you want to talk about, just let us know. We're still in a evolving and kind of growing group. And so we're really interested, if anyone's interested in joining, getting more involved or partnering with us, please just let us know. I put our info at email there in the chat. Yeah, so thanks for being here and hope you have a great day. When you close the browser, if I've set it up correctly, a short, very short survey will pop up. So please take just like a minute or two to fill that out and let us know what you thought of today's session and how we can improve for future sessions. Hopefully I did it correctly and it will pop up. If not, you just get an extra couple minutes in your day. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for being here. And again, thank you, Aline, for hosting this space for us.
Thank you
Really
for your
appreciate it.
partnership.
Yeah. All
Thank you
right.
all so much.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.